Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Surface Navy Association's 29th Annual Conference and Trade Show here in Arlington, Virginia. Raytheon is our sponsor for sponsoring our coverage of this event. And we've got with us Bryan McGrath, a retired legendary naval surface warrior and a key strategist. You're the managing director of Ferry Bridge Group, which is a consultancy. Bryan, you're a naval officer, considered a naval thinker. You've been talking a little bit to the Trump team. Obviously, they've been talking to smart folks all over town about how to think about national security. And particularly, I want to ask you, when it comes to the Navy, what do you think some of the priorities for the new administration have to be?
Well, the number one thing is that they have to articulate a vision for the Congress and the American people about what they want this Navy to do, where they want to do it, to what extent, with what platforms, and how many of them. There has to be a compelling narrative. I don't think that the president wants 350 ships is sufficient to get them. They have to tell a good story.
You were one of the people who actually worked on the Navy strategy going back a couple of years ago, and you were working that issue of the narrative and the case to make for sea power and take it to the American people. There are concerns about some, for example, that the new administration is going to put a premium to cooperate with Russia, for example, to make progress against ISIS, but also to perhaps stop weapons from going to Iran, for example. If you take Russia as an adversary off the table, and then if you're potentially saber-rattling, as some suggest, with China in order to get a better trade deal, and you take potentially China off the table, doesn't that ultimately shape the kind of military forces, but also the kind of Navy you need in the future?
Well, if both of those conditions applied, then yes. The size and shape and the architecture of the Navy would change and would be different than the directions that it's heading in right now. I have a personal sense that at a 273 ship Navy, which we have today, and a goal of 308 ships, which is the outgoing administration's, that goal was sufficient for the world that did not include great power competition.
Right.
If you take great power competition off the table, we're still 35 ships short. Not enough peanut butter for the bread. When you add great powers into the mix, I think you quickly go from 308 up to 350 with both great powers accounted for.
Do you, as you look at, how would you grade the Obama administration's progress on shipbuilding? I mean, obviously, that was a passion for Ray Mabus. They were willing to take readiness gaps and make other efficiency moves within the Navy to increase the shipbuilding budget. How would you grade that? And how do you... Well, let me ask you that, and then I've got a follow-up on the 350 ship question.
Good question. Ray Mabus today, this very day, gave the most compelling and articulate legal case for why numbers matter and why we should continue to build ships. And I was sitting in my chair and I wanted to cheer out loud for him, and I thought this should have been his stump speech every day for 7 years, because he has a lot to be proud of. The Bush administration, I think there was 1 year in which the Bush administration did not build a single combatant. They did reverse the decline in the size of the Navy. If we had continued to build at the Bush levels, we would have an even smaller Navy than we have now. And they've got us on a glide slope to a reasonable increase in numbers, up to 308 by the early 2020s. So I think he gets an A. I think he gets an A. I just wish he had concentrated more on this and made it his sort of singular focus for his tenure.
How do you see, now the 355, it was on December 15, if I recall correctly, that the Navy put out its 355 number. Obviously, that goes in, as Admiral Moran talked about a little bit with us yesterday, that's part of the three-pronged thing that's going to come together to give that sort of future size of the Navy recommendation to answer the congressional call for this multifaceted, right, the FFRDC think tank and the Navy doing its own assessment. How important do you think this 355 number is going into the debates that are going to be coming over the next few years?
Politically, it's a very important number. Navies don't grow unless presidents are behind it. And the president-elect has said that he wants a 350-ship Navy. If he continues to support it, that is one of the ingredients of it eventually happening. In terms of the architecture of the Navy, the number is somewhat less important than the sense that we are considerably smaller than we need to be, and we have considerably fewer capabilities that we need to contend with the threats, as he sees them. And I think that 350 is a good political number. It's a reasonable number to deviate from when you get down to the hard work of force structure assessment.
Do you think, one friend of mine, we were talking about the Reagan, the 600-ship Navy, which topped out at 594, and, we were talking about that era and saying, well, there was a lot of stuff that was in the inventory. Bob Work has made this case also, that we had a lot of ships, but ones that were not actually the most capable ships that we should have had. Is there a danger of putting numbers ahead of actually capability in this case and making sure you're getting the balance right so that you don't just have a whole bunch of things that are haze, gray, and afloat, but are actually haze, gray, and afloat and have some reach and striking power?
Absolutely. But I think oftentimes this is a false choice. People try to corner you and say, well, isn't capability more important than numbers? And the answer to that question is no, it's not more important. You have to have both. This is one of the reasons the Surface Force has come out with this concept of distributed lethality, is that we need to have additional ships, but those ships have to pack more unit capability on each ship, both in order to deliver pain to the other guy and to sustain, to be resilient in battle. It's what Wayne Hughes out at the postgraduate school refers to as the battle of the first salvo. We have to win that. This is what I think this week has been about, and it has been about the importance of conventional deterrence, the importance of making sure that the forces we have postured around the world provide potential adversaries with a sense that whatever it is they're thinking about is either going to be unsuccessful or it's going to be so painful that the juice isn't worth the squeeze. This is deterrence by denial. It is deterrence by delay. It's not the way the Navy looks at deterrence now, which is delay by the punishment of forces over the horizon that'll be here in 40 days. We'll gather 5 or 6 carrier groups and we'll, that's not going to work for great powers that have limited objectives close to home. We have to deter them with what is there. And that is one of the things distributed lethality does best.
You were one of the intellectual, or are among the intellectual proponents of the idea. You've been talking about it for a very long time. For some, including me, I think simplistically, we were talking a little bit earlier, is about reach, right? China has X amount of reach, is trying to push us to the second island chain. We should also have an ability to reach forward. But for you, it's not just a reach question, it's something more sophisticated. Give our audience a taste of the thinking for that, because it was a very, very sophisticated view.
Yeah. This question of being outsticked comes down to some extent, an ego question. They've got longer missiles than we do, and that's not the way to look at this. What we need to look at is that the Pacific is a giant sphere of operations. We increasingly have overhead coverage and other sensor coverage that gives us very, very sophisticated and very accurate targeting that might be fleeting. What you get out of long-range weapons is the ability to shoot on that fleeting information and update it along the way and provide that the targeting to end game when you get another hit. So it really isn't about he's got longer range missiles than I do. It is, I have this wonderful ISR complex that gives me precision targeting, and I need to make the most efficient and best use of the volume that it generates.
I want to ask you one last question, but it's a history and intellectual question. The United States Army and Marine Corps had enormous confidence going into Afghanistan and Iraq, and found themselves bloodied in a very, very complex fight. That the enemy always has a vote, and there are those who look at the United States Navy. If you look at it from a Vietnam standpoint, it was during the Vietnam War. You talk to an Air Force guy who flew over Vietnam, or even a naval aviator, that was a brutal experience that still colors the thinking of the Air Forces. If you look at it from the United States Navy, 70 years, it was 1945 the last time, or even a little bit earlier than that, ships were really being lost, the likes of which, Hornfisher does such a great job in Neptune's Inferno, for example, which I commend anybody to read if you want to get a sense of that. And if you talk to folks in the Navy, there are some folks who say, like, we have a little bit of arrogance that we had then in terms of what might be coming. That it comes down to twisted steel and sinking ships. Talk to British guys. We sailed into the Falklands pretty confident, and we sailed out of the Falklands having lost 6 ships. Is the intellectual change afoot in the Navy, which has enormous pride at being the very best, but the reality that the kind of fight that may be waiting, whether it's with the Russians or potentially with the Chinese, could be something that is very, very sobering and very different from what people or how people think it's going to go?
Well, the rise of other great powers has caused this organization, specifically the Surface Force, to concentrate more on delivering offensive power. I do believe we remain the most effective Navy on the face of the earth, but the other guy gets a vote. The other guys are wily operators. They have considerable capability, and the Surface Navy is thinking very deeply about these things. One of the problems and this is a political problem that we have to figure out how to get through, is we have spent the last 30 to 40 years building immensely successful defensive platforms that gave us the illusion that naval warfare could be conducted without the loss of life and without the loss of ships. Against a high-end opponent, this is simply not the case. The LCS has been pilloried because of its lack of survivability. Some of that has been unfair. All I can tell you is, against the kind of weapons and against the kind of capabilities that our peer competitors can bring, virtually everything in the battle space, whether it's a tank, a plane, a ship, a human, it doesn't matter. Everything is vulnerable in that environment, and we have to get away from this sense of we have to protect everything. We have to figure out how to make the offensive a more effective defensive mechanism.
Bryan, thanks very much. Really enjoyed it, and want to have you come back on regularly, because this is going to be a debate that's going to be evolving over the coming years. Sir, thanks.
Thank you.